Welcome to Putschcast. I'm Oliver Heute, the host of your favorite revolutionary podcast. Yes, usually I do have a co-host. However, all my mates are out and about researching other topics. In the meantime, if you've got an idea, anything you want to learn about, make sure you send us an email to putschcast@gmail.com so we find out what you really want to hear about. Speaking of hearing, you can also now see us. I've mentioned it before. Yes, we have a YouTube channel. So sometimes on this podcast, you might hear me refer to a certain image, map, a graphic. That's because we can insert that on the video stream. If you're on audio, that's fine. You won't miss out on much. But if you want to see what it's all about, check us out, Putschcast on YouTube. And now it's time to bring our guest in, Professor Raanan Rein from the University of Florida.
Thank you for the invitation.
You are a professor from Florida. However, you are in Israel right now. What is your profession and what's your connection to South America?
Well, I'm a historian of modern Spain and modern Latin America. And I've been teaching at Tel Aviv University for very many years, over 30 years. But recently I accepted the invitation from the University of Florida to develop Jewish Latin American studies for them. So we relocated to Central or North Florida, to the college town of Gainesville. And that's where I'm based at the moment. I have no Latin American origin at all, but during my college years, I decided to focus on the modern history of Latin America, and I got to know another young student. We got married. She was born in Buenos Aires. So I'm the only non-Argentine in the family, although my wife usually says that I'm the real Argentine. They have the documents, but I'm the expert on Argentina.
You're not alone there. We just spoke to Mark Galeotti. He's an expert on Russia and the Kremlin. His latest book, I asked him about the co-author. He said, well, that's my wife. And I said, well, I can imagine what your dinner conversations are like. So they just end up talking about Russia and switch between languages as well. That might be the same for you. So where's home for you, Raanan?
Wow, that's a great question. I've been thinking about this recently and quite often, because we usually move between Buenos Aires, Madrid, Spain, and Tel Aviv, and now Gainesville, Florida as well. I'm not sure anymore.
So wherever it's warm, we find you.
No, that's correct, yeah. But maybe it's a sign of the times that people move constantly.
Our character today, the man at the center of this, because Putschcast is all about people trying to either overthrow someone or people who have been overthrown. Our protagonist today, he's experienced both and not just once. His name is Juan Perón. Just in a very quick summary, why is he still relevant today? Why should people learn and know about Juan Perón?
Because we can certainly speak about the afterlife of Juan Perón. He created a political movement which still exists, and it's probably the most important political movement in Argentina during the 20th century. It's still relevant nowadays. Most presidents in Argentina in recent decades belonged to the Peronist party. But it's not just in Argentina. Even looking beyond the Argentine borders, there's no other political movement which has had such an impact on politics, economy, social life, and culture like the Peronist movement created and shaped by Juan Domingo Perón.
Incredible, because many people have movements or even ideology named after them, right? We got Marxism, we got Leninism, Stalinism. Is there a Peronism?
Yes, definitely. There is Peronism. It's an eclectic ideology, but it's a set of values that serves many politicians, that inspires popular masses. When I'm thinking about neighboring South American countries, we had important leaders. We had populist leaders like Getulio Vargas in Brazil, for example, but there's no Vargism, such a political movement. And yes, there is a Peronist movement, very heterogeneous from its very first moments, but it's still alive and still has a major influence on Argentine society.
We'll go on to that towards the end of the podcast. We just learned that he was a man who certainly left a mark on the country, but abroad as well, not just in South America, but even in the Western world. Now, just to anchor him a bit in history, can you give us a rough idea of when he was born, what shaped him, what made him become this unique South American leader?
He was born in the late 19th century in 1895, and he was a product of the military education system of Argentina. In this sense, he was a smart soldier, a smart officer, very interested in history. He used to teach history in the military academy, but he had ambitions from a very early stage. He was a military attaché outside of Argentina, both in South America and in Europe in the 1930s. So he wasn't the typical military officer that one had in mind in Argentina of the mid-20th century, let's say. But he held a conservative worldview, and nobody could expect him to become a leader of a different kind, a leader of a new political party. The Argentine political system was based mostly on two political parties, the Unión Cívica Radical, which was a center-left party, and a conservative party, and there was no reason to believe that he would try to create an alternative in Argentine politics.
Now, that sounds like a classical putschist career. Usually the military is involved. It's usually people who rise through the ranks, and then opportunity knocks. They have very loyal people around them. You then gather the troops, cut the phone lines, storm into the palace, take over power, and then about 10, 15 years later, the same thing happens to you. Okay, so there's a playbook that we've looked at a few times on this podcast. He was abroad as well. I think that's really crucial to his story and his ideology. So, when was the first time he got a bit of a taste of what a coup could do?
Well, the first military coup in Argentina took place in September 1930. At that time, he was too young to play any role in this military coup, but he was an important player, not the most important one, but a key player in the June 1943 military coup. Within a very short time, he became, if not the most important figure within the military dictatorship, then certainly the number two in his importance. By then, he already had some international experience, including being a military attaché in Italy of the late 1930s, ruled by a fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. Very many people tend to claim that Perón was deeply influenced by Mussolini, and that in fact Peronism is a kind of a local Argentine version of Italian fascism. I have a somewhat different opinion. Was Perón inspired to some degree by Mussolini? Yes. He did borrow several ideas, certainly several techniques from Italian fascism. At the same time, he was smart enough to adapt these ideas and techniques to Argentine circumstances. So he created a new kind of ideology which certainly emphasized statism, the role of the state in shaping economic and social relations. He certainly appreciated the charismatic leadership of Benito Mussolini. He was certainly curious about this economic model of fascism, which tried to somehow integrate the working class into a state-controlled political system. He became president in early 1946. By then, we had a completely different international scene. There was no sense in copying Italian fascism. So he created a somewhat different version, which was very Argentine in very many senses.
Fascinating. And it's always important for us to provide context so everyone knows, I think, who Mussolini was and what his regime meant for the people living in Italy, but especially for people that were attacked by Italy, Albania, Abyssinia, and the massacres in Libya as well. But he was there during the prime time, so to speak, right? So he was there during the French campaign when Germany beat France. Italy joined last minute, and was he a fanboy of Mussolini or not? What's your opinion at that time, at least, like when he was still in his prime?
By the German invasion of France, he was already back in Buenos Aires. He was in Italy in 1938, 1939. Like many other conservative figures, politicians, or military officers, including in countries like Great Britain, the fact that Mussolini was able to transform a recently created nation, Italy. Until the late 19th century, there wasn't such a sovereign state. So within a relatively very short time, he managed to transform Italy into a European power. And this was something to admire by very many conservatives, both in Europe and in Latin America. But again, if you look at the Peronist regime, we'll get to it in a couple of minutes, I guess, you'll see that it was a regime based on democratic elections, and it went time and again for elections at the provincial level, the national level, for Congress, for the presidency. This was an electoral or electorally based regime. There was no racism or anti-Semitism that we see in Italy gradually in the 1930s. So I would reject this equation that Peronism equals fascism. But yes, Peron was influenced by fascism and tried to borrow several ideas and techniques from the Italian experience.
Yeah. Most podcast listeners are located in English-speaking countries, including Australia, USA, Great Britain. I myself have never been to South America, let alone Argentina. Just for context, I've heard statistics that Argentina was one of the top 10 countries in the early 20th century. So leading up to the global recession, triggered in 1929. Is that true, that it was quite a wealthy country? And did that then lead to the eventual coups because the situation had declined so much? The economy has just collapsed?
It was a wealthy country, yes, but one has to make a difference between national statistics, which often blur the social reality and do not give us any insight into the life of the majority of people. So we had a very wealthy oligarchy, uh, which enjoyed the commercial ties between Argentina and Great Britain. There was practically no industry in Argentina. It was based mainly on the agricultural sector, on the export of beef, of grains, of cotton, and mostly to the UK. So yes, you arrived in Buenos Aires, let's say in the 1910s or 1920s, and you could see amazing mansions of wealthy people. You could see main theaters. You could see cultural events like in Europe, quote unquote. So Buenos Aires was considered the Paris of Latin America. At the same time, for most people, life wasn't that prosperous or promising.
And as so often with oligarchies, it's a couple of beacons, such as the capital or one or two other main cities, that give you an impression of wealth and abundance, where as soon as you leave the suburbs, travel out a bit, you're in a third world country. Is that what the situation was at the time?
Yes, definitely. Also in the early 1940s, when we had this military coup, which brought Peron within a short time into powerful positions.
We talked about the economy, the situation in the country. It is the second biggest country of South America. There was an industrialization happening following the collapse, and leaders recognizing that maybe agriculture is not everything we can rely on. What was the the international setting during World War II, given that he had a lot of exposure to fascism and sort of was flirting with right wing ideas? Where was Argentina during World War II?
This is an extremely important issue because Argentina's international policy in the 1940s was basically misunderstood by very many. And this international policy created an image of a Nazi fascist country. And more specifically, Juan Perón was considered by many as a Nazi fascist leader. Argentina maintained a neutral position during World War II. In fact, it declared war on Germany in March 1945. That is basically at the end of World War II. Now, it's important to note that 4 different presidents, 2 civilian presidents and 2 military presidents, favored this policy of neutrality, and that according to telegrams and reports sent by the American embassy in Buenos Aires to the State Department in Washington, most Argentines supported this neutral policy. What is more important to note is that Great Britain supported enthusiastically and wholeheartedly the neutral position of Argentina, while the US, from December 1941 and onward, was very much against this Argentine neutrality and considered it as a pro-Axis policy. Why did the UK support Argentine neutrality? Because Argentina was the main supplier of beef and grains to the UK. Think about the people in London. I mean, they had to face very many challenges during these years. The idea of not having access to basic food items was something that caused panic in London. And therefore, by being neutral, Argentine ships were not attacked by German submarines and could make their way from the port of Buenos Aires to English ports and bring food and other agricultural items. On the other hand, once the U.S. entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans wanted all Latin American republics to support this position and declare war on the Axis powers. And most countries followed the orders coming from Washington. Argentina did not. And this is something that the Americans have never forgiven. I mean, if you look at American popular culture, Hollywood movies, TV series, etc., all too often, Argentina is still being identified as a pro-Nazi country. It all has to do with the neutrality maintained during World War II.
Fascinating. So, from a British point of view, that makes total sense what you just said. And America, just like now, likes to control both continents, North and South, right? And he obviously didn't play along. We've mentioned a few dates before. We also said there was a coup in 30 that he was a minor figure in. Was there an actual moment when he seized power? I've described earlier, the classical cutting phone lines and storming the presidential palace. How did Juan Perón actually seize power?
So we have to discuss the June 4th, 1943 military coup, which established a military dictatorship in Argentina. Perón was not the most important figure, the key player in this coup. He wasn't senior enough, and therefore he did not attract much attention at the beginning. Senior generals like Arturo Rawson, like Ramirez, like Farrell were the key figures to lead this military coup. However, Perón gets a somewhat unimportant government entity to lead, and that's the Department of Labor. And within a very short time, he transformed this Department of Labor into a de facto government ministry of labor and welfare. From this position, he starts building a political alliance between himself and the organized labor movement. So he's becoming the only politician who defends the rights of workers, the only politician who cares about work conditions and the like. And gradually he becomes more and more powerful. By mid-1945, he's already the vice president, the War Minister, and the Secretary of Labor and Welfare. Since he became so important and powerful, we see divisions within the armed forces based on personal rivalries, based on political ideology. So Perón has to face opposition within the military government, and we reach a crisis in early October 1945 when he is deposed. There's a kind of an internal coup within the military dictatorship, and he's detained and sent to the island of Martin Garcia. We're talking about October 8, 1945.
So I assume there was no political parties at the time because it was a junta, right? They just ruled in their own right. I assume political activity was pretty much banned. No freedom of the press either, I assume. Was it just a classical military dictatorship where they were fighting over the best posts?
It was a classic military dictatorship. The Congress was closed. Political parties were outlawed. There was no free press, that's true. But when we mention Perón's arrest, Perón spent only a few days in prison. After he was detained, he was already released due to popular demand. And here we get to the a foundational moment of Peronism, which is October 17th, 1945.
So we have an actual birth date. That's the watershed moment of that whole movement that you said is still relevant today. What happened on that day? Why is it so important?
Once Perón was detained, the working class understood that this was an assault not only on Perón himself, but on his social policy as well. So we see a spontaneous movement on the one hand, that is a bottom-up movement. At the same time, there is an effort by the organized labor movement to mobilize workers in defense of Perón, but in fact, it was in defense of their own interests as a social class. Once Perón was detained, very many business figures, very many factory owners told their employees, guys, the party is over. Your defender is not here anymore. So we are back to business as it used to be before Perón became the Secretary of Labor and Welfare. So on October 17th, from the early morning onward, we see hundreds of thousands of workers starting to move from the suburbs of Buenos Aires into the city center. Since public transportation was disrupted, many of them walked for hours from the suburbs into the city center, and they all gathered in front of the presidential palace of the famous Casa Rosada. They practically said, we are here and we will stay here until Perón is released. And the military government found it impossible to deal with such a large number of people, with such a multitude of people, and they released Perón and asked him to go out on the balcony of the presidential palace and address the people and tell them, go back home quietly. And that's what happened. He was released, he was brought to the presidential palace, he was allowed to the balcony of the Casa Rosada, and from there he addressed the people, the massive demonstration of people, and thanked them for their loyalty. And since then, October 17th became the Loyalty Day, Dia de la Lealtad, and told them to go back home. In this very moment, we see the foundation of the movement, the special political but also emotional bond between Perón and the popular masses. And this is, in fact, the beginning of his presidential campaign.
That is an incredible story. I had no idea. So this is what other strongmen would have dreamed of, and they have events like this, but usually people are forced to attend, or they get bribed to attend. This is a military junta. I assume he became too powerful, hence his arrest. So there would have been some infighting. And he's only been there for a few years, like you said. It's not that he's been there for decades and had a huge impact. He's only been there for a few years, right? And he must have had such an impact on the life of people in the factories and the working class of especially Buenos Aires, that they were willing technically to put their health and well-being at risk because it was a military dictatorship and they could have just mowed them down, theoretically, right? But there was so many of them. They fought for this man to release him, get him out of prison, and basically crown him their leader.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. Indeed, within 2 years, in the Secretariat of Labor and Welfare, Perón initiated social reforms that had a major impact, both materially but also psychologically, on the working class. They felt that for the first time they had a voice in the political system, but with reforms like mandatory social security, like paid vacations, collective bargaining, etc., they felt that there was an important change in their lives. And when you read testimonies of workers from the years 1943, 1944, 1945, they say things like, suddenly our boss was nicer to us. Suddenly the factory owner understood that he couldn't continue abusing us as he used to do. So it meant practical, real things in daily life for very many people.
Can you explain to me, or can you give us an insight on who that man was? I know he liked uniforms. Most photographs I've seen of him, he has a very pompous uniform and obviously liked putting on a show. But what was so special about him? Why were people so obsessed with him as a person? Because I also hear the word populist linked to him a lot. And nowadays that has a very negative term. But was he a populist pioneer in a political sense? And what was his personality that so resonated with the people of Argentina?
Peronist populism was unlike contemporary populism, because nowadays we tend to connect populism with an anti-migrant rhetoric, with exclusive policies, sometimes with racism or anti-Semitism. In this case, Peronism is, if you'd like, a left-wing populism. It represents an effort to redistribute the national pie in favor of the working class. It certainly assigned the state a major role in social and economic life. Again, unlike many contemporary populists who tend to be more, let's say, capitalist or neoliberal in the social and economic policies. He was a very charismatic person. He was tall, he was handsome, he was a military officer, he seemed to have a discipline. He used to start working at 5 or 6 a.m. every day. So unlike, corrupt politicians who only try to take advantage of their position and have fun, quote unquote. So this impressed very many people. And yes, during this particular moment, his wife, Eva Duarte, who became Eva Perón, or Evita, was certainly a political asset, and he knew how to use it, to use her for his political ends. She was his second wife, not his first one, and she was rather well-known, not very famous, but a rather well-known actress, and together this power couple definitely changed the face of Argentina.
A little bit like the Shah of Persia did 30 years later, where he relied more on the publicity and popularity of his wife to stay in power, which didn't work out in the end for him either. So that's the Evita Perón. So for everyone who was around in the 90s, there was a musical with Madonna playing Evita Perón, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. I thought it was incredible because I don't think there's that many films made about first ladies, so to speak, let alone first ladies from decades and decades ago. Jackie Onassis is probably another example, but other than that, there's not that many.
That's right.
So he was very charismatic. She obviously was too. They were forced to be reckoned with. And from what I've learned from you is they were quite genuine. So they didn't just put this on. They were actually caring about the people, and especially the little people, the working class, the lower class of Argentina, to genuinely improve their circumstances and livelihoods.
Let me say something about the musical and the movie with Madonna. I loved them and I hated them at the same time. Historically speaking, this is a very biased representation of Eva Duarte de Perón, of Evita, and no wonder that a short time after the movie was released, an Argentine response was produced, another movie called Eva Perón, and not Evita, and portraying a completely different image of Evita.
Can you just explain what the difference was between the two films, between the US adaptation and the Argentinian version?
Well, I'll try to be diplomatic and not too blunt. I mean, not to use bad language. For the opposition in Argentina of the 1940s and 1950s, Evita was basically a prostitute. I mean, she was born in a provincial town. Her parents were not married. So from the legal status point of view, she did not enjoy the same rights as a legal child. She made it to Buenos Aires as a teenager, and supposedly only by jumping from the bed of one man to the bed of another, she made it up until she became the wife of the Argentine president. So she was a fraud. She cared little about the working people. She was trying to enjoy the good life, and that was it.
That was the view of the enemies of the Perons.
Correct. Using
That,
the same information, supporters of Peronism portrayed a different image. She was born in a provincial town. Her parents were not married. She had no chance to make it, quote unquote. But still, because she was smart, because she was hardworking, because she had a vision, she made it up to the top. So we shouldn't, scorn her. We shouldn't talk about maybe she was abused by men. That's possible. But to portray her as a prostitute, quote unquote, as someone who had no talent of her own, but only enjoyed the support of men, this is a bit problematic. Now, once Perón is elected president, she has no government post. She has no formal position. She was not a minister in the government. She was not a secretary in any state entity, but she was certainly the number two, politically speaking. Nobody remembers the name of Perón's vice president at the time. Everybody remembers Perón and Evita. And she became de facto the Minister of Health, of Welfare. She created her own foundation, the Fundación Eva Perón, which supported the construction of thousands of schools, of hospitals, of old age homes, etc. But what is very important to remember is that she set aside a few hours every day to meet common people, quote unquote, and have a few words with them. So every day you had long lines of people coming to ask for something, coming to see her, and she would sit there with, an army of secretaries and assistants. There was a widow who was very poor, and so Evita ordered one of her secretaries to purchase a sewing machine for this old woman. A young couple, they were about to get married. They had no money for the wedding ceremony. So Evita told one of the assistants, okay, give them 200 pesos so that they can have a wedding party. Sick people would come and ask for blessing. So she created a kind of a direct and immediate contact with humble people, and this had an enormous psychological impact, and this contributed to her image as a saint, as an angel.
yeah.
And it was a political asset for Perón, undoubtedly.
Did the reign of those two also have an impact on the lives of women in Argentina? Did that improve in any way?
Definitely. It was during the Peronist decade in 1947 that women got the right to vote for the first time. They could not vote until 1947. Evita created the women's section of the Peronist party. So you had for the first time women as Congress members. Yes, we do see a change in the status and the life of very many women in Argentina. Was Evita a feminist? It's a good question. It's not that clear.
And that is decades ahead than most Western countries. Just for context, we're talking 1940s here. I think the last country in the world to allow women to vote was Switzerland in the 1970s or so. There was one or two cantons where women still weren't allowed to vote. We all know the USA and most of Western countries in the 50s, including Australia as well, women were basically expected to stay home and look after the kids. That was about it. And the whole society to me sounds, and that's the fascinating bit about Peronism, it sounds like socialism to me. Because usually when you hear military dictatorship, although it wasn't, was it? Because he did introduce elections again. So there was.
Definitely. Perón was elected in democratic elections in February 1946. If you read the reports of the American embassy in Buenos Aires, these were considered the fairest and cleanest, quote unquote, elections in Argentine history until then. According to the constitution, president could serve only one term, so Perón changed the constitution, and that allowed him to be re-elected. And in November 1951, he was elected by a larger majority. 2/3 of Argentines voted for Perón. So he was certainly not a dictator, although his government became more authoritarian with the years and tried to limit the independence of the press, to marginalize political opponents, but still Congress was operating, political parties were not outlawed, there were newspapers identified with the opposition, so it wasn't a dictatorship, no.
Especially by South American standards, a very liberal society in that era. Now, Raanan, this sounds like happy after. We've got this presidential couple, they got the oligarchs under control. There's all the civilian liberties that we dream of in this day and age. Happy ever after, or what happened? Because in my introduction, I said there wasn't just one coup, there was a few. His reign didn't last as long as it could have because he was still a quite young man at this stage. Like we're talking 50s now. So how did his presidency end?
With the passing of Eva Perón. She passed away in July 1952. She was only 33 years old. And then something changes in Peronism. And the authoritarian character of the government is becoming clearer every day. And in 1954, he enters into a major clash, a major conflict with the Catholic Church. You had opposition parties, you had opposition groups, but it was only now, with the support of the Catholic Church, that the different forces of opposition could unite, create a kind of a coalition against Peronism. And with this support, we have a coup attempt in mid-June 1955. This is a failed coup attempt, but 3 months later, there is another coup attempt which succeeds. This is September 16th, 1955. Within 3 days, Perón decides to resign and then goes to exile and will spend no less than 18 years in exile before coming back to Argentina.
Now, the Catholic Church we haven't mentioned at all, and that's obviously a power player in South America. Clearly, he didn't have the best relationship, but who were the people behind it, driving it? Was that people from his own ranks, from his own party, or who pulled the trigger to topple him in 1955?
So we have a coalition of opponents to Peronism, including military leaders, military officers. I'll name one or two in a second. Business groups, conservative politicians, and the Catholic Church. So a very heterogeneous coalition, which enjoyed the support of political parties like the Radical Party, the Unión Cívica Radical, the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party. So you have a strange alliance of communists and Catholics together against Peronism. The key figures in the military coup are General Eduardo Lonardi, who starts the rebellion in Cordoba, General Pedro Aramburu, who is a firm opponent of Peronism, Admiral Isaac Rojas. These were the three key military leaders of the coup against Perón, but it was a civil military coup. Unlike the June 1943 coup d'etat, which was basically a military initiative, in this case, in 1955, it's a civil military coup which deposes Perón. Now, within this coalition of opponents to Peronism, you have different opinions, a division among politicians and military officers. So for a few weeks, you have a new, relatively moderate president trying to, in a way, recreate Peronism without Perón. But this lasts for a few weeks only. And then you have a hardliner, General Aramburu, who is firmly anti-Peronist and is determined to de-Peronize Argentine society.
Two questions there. Number one, two coups in 1 year. Why didn't he clean house after the first one? How could a second coup happen a few months later? That's a very unusual circumstance.
On June 16th, 1955, we have aircraft of the Air Force and the Navy bombing the Plaza de Mayo, the central square of Buenos Aires, just in front of the presidential palace, with the idea of assassinating Perón, and they failed. But hundreds of civilians were killed. During the 10 years of Perón in power, only a handful of people lost their lives by political violence. On this day, the opponents of Peronism basically kill hundreds of civilians. From this moment on, we see an even deeper polarization in Argentine society. Perón tries to regroup his supporters, but he finds less enthusiasm than he expects. By mid-September, when the second coup attempt starts, he understands that if he stays in power, Argentina would be on its way to a civil war. And he's not willing to take upon himself the responsibility of such a bloodshed. He prefers to resign and go to exile.
Was he a really good guy? He sounds like a leader you dream of. Like it, the way he came to power is so different to the way he reigns. And usually people go the other way, right? Usually there's a lot of enthusiasm and support. And as soon as they're in power, everything is about them staying in power, and they do everything to do so, walk literally over dead bodies. He seems to do the opposite. You just mentioned there was a few dozen people that died of political violence in all this time, and he was in power for what, 8, 9 years or so, almost a decade. And then his opponents who claimed to set up a better government killed 300 people in a day. And then, like any other ruler who would then start purges and clean the ranks and make sure he's only surrounded by loyalists, he then a few months later willingly steps down for the sake and good of the country. That is very rare.
This is remarkable, I agree. I wouldn't say a good guy. He was a military officer and a politician. He usually knew how to play his cards. At that specific moment, he understood that he couldn't win the game. Look, when he goes back from Italy in 1939 to Argentina, he goes through Spain. Spain in 1939 was after a 3 year of a bloody civil war. He saw the horrible results of a civil war. And in 1955, he's not willing to be responsible for a civil war in his own country, Argentina. Yes, most dictators for sure, but most politicians would do everything to stay in power, even for one more day, one more week, one more month. But at this point, he decided that it made no sense for him to call his supporters to go out to the street, take arms, and fight the rebels.
And it's 1955. It's called Revolución Libertadora.
Yeah, the liberating revolution, which is somewhat funny because the revolution was supposed to end a dictatorship and in fact instituted a dictatorship. The effort from now on is to de-Peronize Argentine society, to erase any memory of Peronism. The media wasn't allowed to mention the names of Juan Perón or Eva Duarte de Perón. Sometimes editors simply wrote P when they referred to the Peronist party. They couldn't say Peronist party, so they wrote PP. The Peronist party was outlawed. And in 1958, when there are presidential elections again, after 3 years of a military dictatorship, the Peronist party is not allowed to participate. So the political system from 1955 until 1973 is based on the exclusion of a large section of the population. They have no representation. Yes,
Yeah.
you do have elections in 1958, and there's a civilian president, but he's deposed in yet another military coup in 1962. Then again, when the trade unions, which remain loyal to Peronism, becoming somewhat more powerful, you have another military coup in 1966, and then again in 1976.
What a feeling that must have been for him after almost 2 decades in exile to then be begged by the people that once ousted you, more or less, to come back and run the country because no one else can. We recently did a podcast on the Mexican Revolution. That's obviously a bit earlier in history. But what I took away from that, and I recommend listeners to check it out, it's on our YouTube channel, on Spotify, is that it was an absolute mess. And once this instability was triggered, the country didn't calm down for decades and decades and decades. There was no phase of stability. And after all, they ended up with what they had before. So it really didn't go anywhere. So I'm not going to use the word the liberation revolution because that's clearly a propaganda term by the people that ousted Peron. And I said 2 questions before. You perfectly answered the first question, why he didn't clean house. I actually have 2 more questions. So one more is obviously we remember what you told us, how he came to power. It's the people that stormed the Capitol initially when he was arrested and then, gave the government no other chance but putting him in power. Why was that not the case in 55? Why didn't the people rise again when their elected president was clearly ousted and 300 people were killed along the way?
It's a great question because there's no simple answer. It's clear that during his first term as president, the economic conditions, both at the world market and in Argentina itself, were more favorable, and there was money to distribute. So it was easier for Perón to push forward his social reforms. This was not the case during the first half of the 1950s. We see economic recession in Argentina, so there's less enthusiasm among people in general, the working class in particular, because real wages are losing their purchase power. As I said, in 1952, Evita passed away. It seemed that Perón adopted more conservative policies, and then his conflict with the Catholic Church somehow pushed away more than a few supporters of his, including people who had key positions within the Peronist party. So taking all of these factors together, you see why there's less enthusiasm among people to risk their lives, as you said about the October 1945 demonstration to risk their lives in support of Perón.
Maybe he wasn't the same on his own. Maybe really the loss of his wife changed him as well. They were a power couple, and then he seems to have lost that sense of reading the room and reading the nation. So he should have known that the Catholic Church is probably something he should be more cautious around, rather than just pushing ahead with whatever reforms he had in mind. And then, last question from me on the 1955 coup. This is obviously all in the global context. This is the first height of the Cold War, right? So the Soviet Union by then has their own nuclear weapons. America does. We're not far off from the Cuba crisis or the Berlin Wall being built a few years later. Was there any foreign interference in the 1955 coup? Anything that we know from the records, from the sources? Did anyone outside of Argentina have an interest in Peron being toppled?
Yes, definitely. It's clear that in the State Department, in the Pentagon, in the White House, they always viewed Perón and Peronism with suspicion. His social policy seemed like being socialist or even communist. His emphasis on the role of the state in both social life and economic life, the fact that during World War II he was part of a government which supported neutrality and did not support the US position. Perón wasn't to the liking at all. They certainly wished for a different government in Buenos Aires. Were they actively involved in the efforts to depose Perón? It's not entirely clear. It's not the case of Guatemala of the 1950s. It's not the case of the Dominican Republic. There's no such direct involvement of the US, but were they encouraging both civil and military groups in Argentina to take action? Yes. So-called liberating revolution. It was certainly anti-communist. Perón was trying to steer a way between the two blocks, between the Western camp and the Soviet bloc. The new regime of 1955 was certainly more clearly anti-communist. So yes, there was an interest, there was some external involvement in the events taking place in Buenos Aires.
Everything always happens in context. Thank you for sharing that for us. You already told us about his third presidency in the 1970s, believe it or not. So this man really has shaped the history of Argentina for decades, even when he wasn't in the country. How did it all end for him politically and physically, maybe as well?
Yeah, that's right. So he returns to Argentina with the hope of basically everyone that he would somehow stabilize the situation. Argentina between the years 1955 and 1973 went through so many political and economic upheavals that there was a kind of a yearning for a stable political system. Perón is not that young anymore. In 1973, he's 78 years old. We do have nowadays presidents of this age, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. Yeah, in 1973, he's not that energetic anymore. He has health issues. This time, he doesn't take any risk, and he decides that his third wife would be his running mate. So people are called to vote for Perón Perón, Juan Perón for the presidency, and Isabel Perón for the vice presidency. And indeed, they win handsomely these elections, but he's in power for a very short time. Within a few months, on July 1st, 1974, he passed away, and the presidency falls into the hands of his third wife, who is nothing like Evita Perón, who is unable to control the country, and the country starts this spiral movement towards political violence and chaos. And when the military takes power on March 24th, 1976, very many people in Argentina feel relieved because once again, they want to put an end to chaos and instability.
He really had a thing for partnership, didn't he? Like he didn't rule on his own. He did the same thing again, even in his older days, in the 70s. He had a running mate, you said.
Like in the American system, also in the Argentine system, you always have a running mate. And Perón was very careful in choosing his running mates, had to bring political capital with them. He did not opt for Eva Perón as a running mate in the 1951 election campaign. But this time, after being away for such a long time, it's difficult for him to trust basically anyone, and he decides on his wife to be his running mate.
His third wife, Isabella Perón. An image is circling the social networks these days. When I researched this story of her, I think even after his passing, even still in the late 70s, giving the Nazi salute, right, to followers of his, which takes us to the end of our interview, but something we shouldn't forget about, because when people hear Argentina 1950s, it's often linked to the story of the red lines. For listeners who don't know what the red lines are, because earlier on you said you don't see him as a replica of fascism, let alone NS ideology, but why did he welcome so many war criminals from Europe?
Yeah, there's a myth here about Argentina being the refuge for Nazi war criminals or perpetrators. Um, Indeed, too many Nazis, former Nazis, found their way to Argentina, but it wasn't part of an organized campaign by Perón to bring in Nazis. Perón was mostly interested in bringing in uh, German scientists, engineers, technicians. In this case, his policy wasn't that different from the American policy, the Soviet policy, or the policy of very many other countries. Almost everyone wanted to take advantage of recruiting top-notch scientists and engineers trained in Germany for various years. And then the Vatican, the Catholic Church, also put pressure on him to allow Catholics fleeing the Red Army in Eastern Europe to get entry visas to Argentina. So, for example, the entire Croatian government, which had collaborated with the Third Reich, found its way to Argentina.
Is that the Ustascha you're talking about?
Correct.
Who
Yes,
are partially worse than the SS in some instances.
that's right. So Ante Pavelic and his entire government found their way to Argentina. In the case of war criminals, like Adolf Eichmann or Josef Mengele and others, they entered Argentina with false documents under false names. And it's not that they were welcomed by the authorities. It's not that they were able to find lucrative positions, etc. Most of them remained within a small bubble of former Nazis. When Mossad agents arrived in Buenos Aires looking for Adolf Eichmann, they cannot believe that this architect of the Holocaust is living in a humble house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. So it's not that Eichmann, under the name of Ricardo Clement, was able to have a new prosperous career in Argentina. So too many Nazis entered Argentina, yes. Was it part of an elaborated plan by the Peron government? No. But yes, the image sticks. Too many people tend to look at Argentina as the place for Nazis at the end of World War II.
And you're certainly not a biased expert because your expertise is Jewish life, history, culture in South America, right? So you would have looked at other countries as well. And you're saying statistically, that's not correct to say that this was the safe place for Nazis after the war.
Yeah, several dozens of war criminals made their way to Argentina. Yes, that's several dozens too many. You know, Nazis and war criminals looked for refuge in different countries, all too often as far as possible from Europe, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, etc. Argentina was more attractive for Nazis, basically because they were racist. So they preferred a country with a large white population and not with a large indigenous or of African descent population. There was already a large German community in Argentina, the product of immigration processes from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Argentina seemed attractive, not necessarily because Perón was in power.
Thank you for the context there. Good to know. And it reminds me a bit of what we talked about earlier about the Madonna movie that really had no good intentions for Argentina. And obviously, there was a lot of post-World War II, Cold War propaganda or entertainment, Frederick Forsyth novels, the Odessa File, that focus on that period, and it's just easy to pick out a country, and that's how it was. But interestingly enough, the Catholic Church had a clear role to play here, the ones who then ousted Perón. Who helped to get many of those war criminals to Argentina at the first place. Is that correct?
Yes, the Catholic Church played an important role in preparing the escape routes from Austria and Germany through Italy to South America, or more specifically to Argentina.
I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for the insights in this fascinating character. And honestly, when I did my research, there isn't that much in English on Juan Perón, more on his wife. But again, a lot of this you have to take with a grain of salt, as we've just learned. And I hope that this podcast helps many people who are interested in South American history to really understand this character that shaped the country until this day. And that's my last question for you today, because that's how we started. How is Argentina in the mid-2020s still shaped or influenced by Peronism?
Undoubtedly, Peronism and the Peronist Party are still key players, major actors in the political scene. The previous president was of the Peronist Party. Some say that maybe the next president would be also from the Peronist Party. But Peronism has always been very heterogeneous. So different political leaders claimed to be the true heirs of Perón, some of them of a neoliberal character, like Carlos Menem in the 90s, some of them more identified with the left-wing current of Peronism, like Christina Kirchner. But still, this is a brand that attracts the support of millions of Argentines. Yes, it's still alive and kicking decades after Perón himself passed away.
Professor Raanan Rein, thank you so much for your time. People want to find out more about you. We put a profile and a link to your work on our website, pushcast.com. For everyone else, thank you for watching or listening to this episode. Yes, I said watching because we now also have a YouTube channel. Yes, not very well visited yet, but let's change that. Tell your friends and family about Pushcast on YouTube. You can see interviews, obviously. You can see a lot more context because we put photos up, maps, and more information that you won't be able to listen to on the actual podcast. And of course, please follow us if you can on Instagram, where we update you every week on content that's coming up. And if you have any ideas, suggestions for a topic, shoot us an email, pushcast@gmail.com. I'm your host, Oliver Heute. Thank you for listening, watching. See you soon.